Good evening, everyone, and welcome to the Ann Arbor Area Transportation Authority Board of Directors meeting. It is Thursday, January 24th, and wait, is today the 25th? I think I said that wrong. It's the 25th, pardon me, of 2024, and I see that we do have a quorum present. We're going to move on to the first order of business, which is approving our agenda. Would someone like to make a motion? Are there any changes on the agenda? Yes, Matt.
Only a note that under item 121, we were going to be introducing our new manager of public affairs, Mr. Jeff Pfeiffer. Unfortunately, due to a family emergency, he's not able to be with us this evening. He sends his regrets. He has met several of you in committee meetings. He will continue to attend committee meetings, and we look forward to officially welcoming him in February.
We send him our condolences. Thank you. With that, are there any other changes to the agenda? And if not, would someone care to make a motion to approve the agenda? Moved by Mike, seconded by Simi, and all in favor, raise your hands. And that passes unanimously. Thank you very much. Second order of business is public comment. I don't see anybody for public comment in the wings here. Deb, is there anyone online?
Yes, Jim Mogensen, and you are unmuted.
Thank you.
So I attended the University of Michigan's Regents meeting in December, and I was actually talking to them about bonding and Michigan medicine finances. But while I was there, the Central Student Government gave a report. And the report was that they had identified an issue, and that was finding ways to get students to the airport. And they started the program, and they were very proud. They got 800 students in this new program to the airport for Thanksgiving, and they were looking forward to dramatically increasing that for the holidays. So I just bring this up because this is one of those things that can happen under the radar. It's not on any of the official channels. It just kind of happens, and it would be worth watching, because if for some reason this continues on and there's a parallel service to TheRide, it could dramatically impact the community service to TheRide as to whether or not Michigan Flyer continues to provide that service if there's a dramatic drop off in ridership if it switches to this other type of service. So I just wanted to bring that up. Second thing is the challenge as both, not just so much the board, but it's certainly community members look to use metrics to look at different transit systems, even public school systems and the University of Michigan transit system have a very different, as you are probably all aware, have very different dynamics as it relates to being able to be not just in cold weather, but have long routes that make battery-powered service more difficult. The conversation can be impacted by people continually including that in the conversation. And finally, the proposal for the zero emission proposal is not surprising, but it has the risks that that with the hybrid buses, unless there's been some change in funding, the same challenge that happened when the millage was first passed in 2014, with the structural problem with the hybrid buses being much more expensive than the emission diesel buses, could happen again. So I just bring that up as something to keep in mind as you continue your conversations. As always, thank you very much for your time and attention.
Thank you, Mr. Mogensen. Is there anyone else, Deb?
No, we have no other public commenters.
Thank you so much. That closes public comment, and we will move on to general announcements. I do have one unfortunate general announcement to make. LAC experienced a loss over the Christmas holidays of a long time, over 20-year plus member of the executive and member of the executive team of that local advisory council. And so I want to recognize Jody Burton-Slowens for all the work that she has done, and also send out our condolences to the family and her friends. She will be sorely missed. Are there any other general announcements? Seeing none, that closes out general announcements, and we'll move on to our consent agenda. Would someone like to make a motion to approve the consent agenda as it's presented? Oh, that would be Rich. Thank you so much. It's seconded by Kyra. All those in favor, please raise your hands. Thank you very much. That passed unanimously. Next on our agenda is ownership linkage, and that's Mr. Rich Chang.
Hey, everyone. Good evening. A little more in-depth update today. So we have been working on trying to get more outreach with our legal owners. The remaining two that we want to reach out is the city, Ypsi, and Ypsilanti Township. Those are still ongoing, but we are actually going to, in parallel, start working on our moral owners outreach. And so that's actually, there's some discussions that I'm going to start having with our policy governance coach and also with Kathleen to really, I think, figure out maybe like a strategic plan or a way that we can actually approach ownership linkage moving forward. So we have some kind of idea as to like, what is our mission and vision and how we actually going to accomplish what we want to do with that. There is also a telephone survey that was performed in 2021 that the AAATA hired Hugh to help us out. And the report actually was part of the data points that we utilized when we're going through the whole millage process. We didn't really get a chance to really dig into or hear Hugh's commentary around those results. And so Kathleen and I just chatted earlier, and we are going to have some discussions, which we'll bring to the board as a recommendation to have Hugh come in and actually in one of our board meetings go through that report with us. And then we can also ask a lot of questions, because we think actually there's quite a bit of nuggets within that report, which will actually help us in particular with the moral ownership linkage that we're trying to achieve. And that's all I have for now for the ownership linkage.
Thank you, Rich. Does anyone have any questions or comments for Rich? Seeing none, we'll close out that agenda item and we will move on to 4.1, which is ends monitoring. And that is Mr. Carpenter and Ms. Rosemary Anayuki.
Thank you, Madam Chair, board members. It's a pleasure to see everyone on this foggy evening. Our ends monitoring report is our big annual report on meeting the board's overall outcome goals for the agency. The report begins on page 21 of your packet. As I do normally, I'm just going to hit some highlights and then, Madam Chair, turn it over to you and the board for any questions or discussion. So I'd love to have you turn to page 23, which is our wonderful amber, green, red stoplight assessment of how we are suggesting our compliance was in these various areas. So we're reporting overall partial compliance for the policy, largely due to a couple of sub-policies that were partially or non-compliant. I'd like to touch those very quickly. The obvious one that draws our eye is the red one, policy 123, which is on page 21 of the report. That one has to do with external public policy. And as several of you noted in your comments, you did catch that there had been a change here. This had previously been compliant. One of you in the survey comments had also noted that we actually did a lot of stuff this year in this space, particularly when we look at the City of Ann Arbor's QC1 zoning, transit supportive zoning. It's hard to say, why is it red? We did a lot of good stuff in there. The reason there, as was, and this question was asked in the service committee, really because I moved the bar on myself. And with a new interpretation in place, I had to say we were not compliant. Previously, it had been about whether or not city councils were enacting these policies, which is a little problematic to hold me accountable for the decisions outside parties make. And that had always been a little difficult for me to completely get my head around. So knowing that I had a new manager of public affairs and we were standing up an entire advocacy section to the organization, I changed the interpretation to be much more about things we could control. that we would be bringing a legislative agenda to you for some feedback, and that we would be making notable progress towards achieving those advocacy goals. As I have not yet done that in this previous year, although I have plans to do it, I have to give myself a red mark there as non-compliance. I've also noted the timeline for compliance is June. I intend to bring to you by then that legislative agenda so that we can all discuss it and decide how we are moving forward on that sort of outward facing part of it. So that is why 1, 2, 3 is red. Above it, 1, 2, 2 is yellow. This has to do with the frequency of bus services in one corridor did not meet the targets that we were shooting for. This had to do with having higher frequency services in order to be attractive for higher density development. We gave ourselves some aggressive targets on that. We had to report non-compliance because there are some routes on Packard and Plymouth that are not yet, I think, at 30 minutes, but they will be in 2024. One of you thoughtfully caught, hey, it's 2024 now, could you be more specific? That's part of the millage. We're talking Sunday services. That'll be by September of 2024. We apologize for the oversight there on the timeline. Those two roll up to make policy 1.2 partially compliant, so that's the explanation for that. Directly above that, 1.1.2 about persons with disabilities. This pertains to a perennial question for us bus stops. I feel like we're getting closer and closer to being able to say this correctly. This again has to do with my interpretation. My interpretation was that we will be 100%, have lead walks at 100% of our bus stops near sidewalks. That's the goal, and I think it's the right goal. And we did, I think, actually accelerate considerably from previous years on moving that ball down the field. Nevertheless, it's not 100% yet, and I'm not forecasting it being 100% until 2033. So I'm starting to suspect, and I may be looking for some feedback as to whether or not this interpretation maybe needs to be adjusted to say, we're making reasonable progress each year, we're on schedule to be 100% by 2033, but nevertheless, for the year, that was the interpretation I had, so I kept it there as it is. That is the reason rolling up to policy 1.1 being partially compliant, and for that reason, the overall ENGE report is partially compliant. So with that, I will maybe turn your attention to page 25, where we start to see our bar graphs, or excuse me, our line graphs on ridership. And I'm just going to speak about this briefly. This really is our core metric, certainly not our only metrics. The ENDS policies cover a lot of things, but as we've discussed, this is our highest level one. And you can see us and our agency peers and a national averaging starting to show here in terms of how we're doing. I do apologize that we neglected to label the lines this year. It was an oversight, but thank you for being patient with that. You can see, interestingly, that there's a lot of noise still in this space. Some are bouncing back faster than others. We're still above the peer average. It's in green, where the blue line, above such agencies as Flint, below Grand Rapids and Lansing in terms of total ridership, but we were that way before the pandemic too. So we're all recovering, and you can see us in the context of the industry. That's why I like this graph. It's not just our line in isolation. Similarly, on the following pages, you see rides per capita and cost per trip following similar patterns. So with that, I want to maybe say just a few things about the board notes in the survey going forward, and then Madam Chair, turn it over to you guys for questions. So this is really great. We have had, I think, some of the most incisive comments in a while on the ENDS report here, and I thank you enormously for them. It demonstrates a great deal of thought putting into this. I see a mixture of comments in here. Overall, it's green across the board. The majority of the board in all of the categories felt the interpretations were reasonable and the evidence was satisfying. So that's good. It feels like we're definitely on target. Nevertheless, a lot of the comments raise, I think, important questions, some that we've noted for ourselves, and just I'll hit maybe a couple of highlights for you. Overall, this really dovetails well into, so I think, two streams of work that I'm seeing coming from this. First, some of these comments are very appropriate for, a monitoring report about the past. Are these interpretations reasonable? Is the evidence satisfactory? Other comments, I think, are possibly more board-to-board comments. Is this degree of achievement and compliance good enough? There's definitely some feelings, particularly around ridership in these comments, that we should be shooting for higher targets. And that's a fair comment. We spent a lot of time in this last year sort of clarifying for ourselves the role of monitoring and judging past performance against the interpretations that existed versus things that the board wanted to focus on for the future. Is this an area for maybe writing policy or clarifying policy in the future? So there's a mixture of things throughout this report that I think fall into both of those comments, whether they are regarding this monitoring report or something that you as the board would like to take forward for policy consideration. I think that is entirely up to you. There is one example I thought was, so on page 54, regarding policy 111, a comment there that the interpretation is not reasonable because it doesn't link 50% discount with economic challenges. I think that's a comment that basically say the rationale for the interpretation isn't good enough. You may discuss that as a body and say, maybe you're right. I think that one's a good example of something pointing at the interpretation itself. Below that, on the same page regarding 121 is a comment about maybe we should set a target on the ridership increase, a minimum target. Is any increase good enough, or should we shoot higher? That to me is more of is that an annual plan of work question for future policy development? It's both. It's good to see them both on the same page. I think you have a lot of substantive material to work with in those comments for both cases. So I will wrap up my comments here saying, yep, we got some good comments here on the monitoring reports, but overall, generally the interpretations are being judged as reasonable in the survey and the evidence satisfactory based on the overall scores, notwithstanding some individual points that I think are worth your consideration. Some of it might make more sense in your annual plan of work discussing policy development. So with that, Madam Chair, I'm happy to sort of rest my introduction and see where the board would like to take this. And we are hoping that the monitoring report can be accepted this evening at some level.
Thank you, Mr. Carpenter. We appreciate you. With that, we're opening up for discussion to the board. Is there anyone who'd like to raise any questions that may not have arisen while Mr. Carpenter was giving his report? Oh, Jesse?
Thank you. I had left one comment saying with the overall policy 1.0, saying that you're that you had said that growth needed to be in line with national and regional peers, which indicated to me that if regional peers growth had negative growth as long as ours was comparable, that according to that interpretation you would be in compliance. Do you and I don't personally don't think that's I think we want to have growing ridership. I guess posting that hypothetical to you, if we had a decrease of ridership, but it was less than what our peer, or it was no greater than what our peers experienced, would you consider yourself to be in compliance?
So two parts to the answers, and yes, broadly speaking. It is the CEO's interpretation that you're holding him accountable for. So that's why it's important that you either accept it or not. That's a group speaking with one voice kind of decision. And in the interpretation that we've had for several years, it uses that language in line with others. It didn't say every year will be higher. And looking at the events of the last few years, I'm kind of glad we did put that in, because there are many things that influence ridership that are beyond the control of the agency and difficult to hold staff accountable for. So a global pandemic being a key example of that. But yes, as the interpretation is written today, as long as it stayed in line with sort of industry trends, yes, it would be.
All right, I appreciate your clarifying that. I had two other questions. Going to the ridership frequency metric, so some of the routes on the system are split, such as we have the 5A, 5B, the 6 and 24 are also kind of complementary routes. And I know in the past, so I guess that got me wondering, is the measurement of frequency, is that the measurement of frequency to every stop along every route, or is that just departures? So for instance, if you had like the 6 and the 20, I've heard the 6 and the 24 presented to the public in joined, or let's say the 5A and the 5B to keep it more simple. If the 5A and the 5B each only take off once every hour, but they alternate, then would you claim half-hour frequency? So if they alternated every 30 minutes, would you claim 30-minute frequency for that, or not, since not every stop is getting that 30-minute frequency? Yeah, I think so. I think your mic is off.
This is a reference, I believe, to policy 122 on page 39. Is that correct?
Yes.
So this is a policy about transportation options producing conditions favorable to more compact and walkable development.
Right.
It's not specifically about, it's not a service standard, as we would sometimes call it in the industry, about a minimum acceptable headway or frequency per route. This doesn't speak to routes. This speaks to corridors and sections of roads. So Washtenaw Avenue, Plymouth Road, Huron State Street. And I apologize, I don't have a timetable and a system map in front of me at the moment. But yes, some of our larger routes, like the 5, do branch. And so you'll have, maybe combined 15-minute frequencies on the core of it. But when it gets to a less dense area, the routes, maybe one direction branches and the other direction comes the other way. On those, you're going to have 30-minute frequencies. And then it might come back together. And again, you'd have a merged 15-minute frequency, if that makes sense. So this is particular to areas we're looking for development. It's not trying to say there's a uniform frequency along an entire route. This doesn't really pertain to the routes. It pertains to the corridors, and then only the segments of those corridors where development is forecast, expected, desirable, something along those lines. So to your direct question, does every bus stop along a route get the frequency implied here? No, it's not about the bus route. It's about the segment of the route, the corridor.
Okay. And my final question, getting to the ridership per capita, you have the charts from SEMCOG for Ann Arbor and Ypsilanti. And I was wondering for an explanation of why only those two municipalities are used as reference for that particular part of the monitoring report and not our entire service area.
Do you have a page, just to make sure I'm on the same type?
Yeah. Maybe
44?
38?
Is it this one?
No.
Oh, sorry, I misspoke.
Maybe page 44?
Let me see.
With a
I'm
nice,
looking at the chart on page 44.
yes. So I'm going to give what I think is the right answer, and then Ms. Nijuki can correct me if I get it wrong. So the question, as I understand it from Mr. Miller, is why is it just Ann Arbor and Ypsilanti? Why is it not a different geography or other geographies that might be in our service area? The short answer is this is the only data that SEMCOG provides. We, I think, looked for Ypsi Township, for example. They don't provide that. They don't provide Pittsfield Township either. Why? I don't know. I suspect it has to do with some limits on the forecasting model, which is the computer simulation they house for this region that they use to generate this information. So I believe what this is showing is this commute to work mode share. So this is when the transportation engineers and planners set together, they design the transportation system around the peak of rush hour, not, for example, what happens on Sunday night. They're designing for the maximum. So the models tend to be built on that assumption, and they don't necessarily have the same level of detail for the entire geography. And what's shown here is the two areas, in Washtenaw County where we do in our service area that they do have, that we can pull from their community explorer survey, which is available online if anyone would like to go view it. It's great information. And you can see Ann Arbor at the top with 8.1% commute mode share for public transit. It looks like it's the fourth highest in the Southeast Michigan region, and Ypsilanti at 9.7, the second. That's fairly traditional. Usually the highest is Highland Park. But again, they're looking at it from a regional level. It's only people commuting to work. It's only in the peak of rush hour, and the geographies are limited. We have to take what we can get.
Thank you.
And if I might add something on there, you'll notice through here several different ways to try to explain ridership. We have the line graphs at the back. We have this SEMCOG data. I think there's another one in here. They're all trying to talk about the same or similar things in different ways because ridership is important. In this particular case, the only, this is mode share. This is like market penetration if you're in the retail business. It's actually the best, most commonly used transportation metric for this space, but it only pertains to people commuting to work. If you're going on a social trip or grocery shopping, you just don't count in this number. So the only place I can credibly use this number is under policy 131 that says I facilitate labor mobility. I know that it is sort of the top line number that most engineers would use to look at transportation system management, but we felt it really only directly applies in this one case.
All right, thank you for that. And I also appreciate the correction of my mistake there, so thank you.
Susan.
I jumped in ahead of you, Rich. So mine were a couple of the questions relating to, for me anyway, the responses in some instances did not feel like they were answering the policy, that the provision of service is not the same thing as documenting and giving evidence of impact. So an example was visitor. And my question was, why are you not providing data like the football shuttles? You actually have data on visitors, as opposed to saying, well, we provide service to Amtrak. The provision of service is not the same thing as documenting impact. The labor mobility, we just mentioned this. I assume, have data on TheRide and GoPass. Those are users that are going to work. And I would imagine that would be a more responsive answer than we provide service to all the places where people work around the community. I'm not sure that the provision of service is the same thing as actually giving us a response to our policy. And so I'm raising it just because I think for this, I felt like I was giving you points where you felt you weren't as compliant, and then there were points where I thought, well, maybe not so compliant, but it's just more of a statement more for the future. It would be great if we could get into more of the micro analysis of who's on those buses and why are they on those buses. If we have data, a good example is that TheRide, it would be helpful to be able to understand what the impact is through actual, who's actually on the bus and when. And I thought things like that football shuttle, I know you hear me talk about that ad nauseum, but that's a really easy one to document visitors. Who else would be coming from the hotels to go to a football game? going to be visitors. So it just, for the future, I would like to actually get in a little bit deeper and not just point to service. Oh, by the way, we go within 15 minutes of every place where someone works, and actually get into more data about who the riders are and why they're on that bus.
If I might, I think this is an excellent point, and it kind of gets to the question of output versus outcome. So the output is we put service on the road. But is that the outcome of your policy? I think that's a very valid question. And we have a range of answers in this report that kind of bounce around on that subject. Some of them have very, I think, good ones. The mode share one, frankly, from SEMCOG, there is no better scientific answer to that question because they're the only ones with a computer model that can tell us a number, and it's frighteningly accurate. So that's, I think, the best answer there. We run into limitations of what evidence we can provide and how expensive it will be to create the evidence. So visitors, yes, we do onboard surveys, and I believe we ask, what's the purpose of your trip? But we don't do them very often. So extrapolating a sample from 2 or 3 years ago and applying it to today's numbers, it gets a little wonky. Yes, we could use the football shuttles. Arguably, yeah. It is, but those are not our normal services. Those are shuttles laid on expressly for a particular point. Is that what you were getting for in the policy? If it is, then my interpretation doesn't include it, and it's an easy win that we could add. But my interpretation of this has been more carry visitors on the regular service that we already have. I also have traditionally been a little uncomfortable with the football shuttles. I think it's legal, but it's not something I like to draw a great deal of attention to. The most, I think, profound example of the limits of data, good example Susan's already mentioned, the TheRide program. The university is a great program, great partner. Everyone, student, faculty, staff can swipe their TheRide card, get on the bus, goes through our same mags type thing. We have no idea why they are traveling. And the U of M only gives us aggregated anonymous data. So I have no idea if they're traveling for class, for work, for a social reason. So it's difficult for me to tell you with any credibility, even when we have that kind of data, and we could trace it to an individual like ID number. The university withholds most of that information from us and gives us aggregated information, as they should, protecting personal privacy. But I think the most challenging example of the phenomena that Susan's pointing out is actually on policy 1.1, begins on page 28. This is where I think we hit the output outcome issue the hardest. And one of the biggest challenges that we've been working through for several years has to do with how do you measure accessibility? If that's the goal, we provide access to destinations. We don't provide mobility per se. I could drive people around in circles and they accomplish nothing, but hey, lots of vehicle miles traveled has racked up. That's good for mobility. It's terrible for access. It's access to destinations that we're trying to measure here. We run into methodological limitations. So for this example, if you wanted to know, for example, Mary lives off Washtenaw Avenue, how many daycare centers are within a half an hour ride for Mary, from her home? We could do that. But when you start to scale that up to, and Jennifer and Bob and Jorge and the 50,000 other people, we don't have any technology capable of measuring accessibility at that scale across an entire network. I have asked the university professors here who pitch accessibility versus mobility. They have not been able to give me an answer about how would I measure accessibility. I have put key consultants in our industry on the spot at industry conferences. They've been pushing this, and I said, yeah, but how do you actually do it? And he said, I'll talk to you afterwards. And then he ducked out of the room and avoided me. So and Rosa and I think we went back and forth on this one for like a year. So what we defaulted to is, here are maps of our service areas with the walking distance buffer around it and some of the key destinations. To Susan's point, this is an output map. That's what this is measuring. It doesn't get as close as I would like to as the outcome of your policy. I don't know how to get there, and it will be probably excruciatingly expensive to do it. The only thing I can think of would be a customized model, computer model, and that's going to be prohibitively expensive. So we do see these sorts of things crop up in the monitoring report from time to time. We love to get as close to the outcome as we can. On occasion, we have to look to the output.
Sure, and I just wanted to add a little bit about the visitor. So we do have the onboard survey, and we've done that in October, in April, and the data can still be extrapolated to provide meaningful information. For visitors, they visit for different reasons and throughout the whole year. So to have actual meaningful information, we would have to be able to track, first of all, the reasons they visit. So there's games, there's weather-related reasons, there's personal reasons, and it's throughout the whole year. So unlike with the board survey, where we're able to still get meaningful data and extrapolate it to provide information in terms of demographics and other things that we're trying to track, the visitor one is a little bit tricky. So for policy 1.33, because that's the one that addresses visitors, it's requiring that public transportation is used by visitors. And that's why in our interpretation, we're saying we have bus stops in all these intercity carriers to be able to provide services to the visitors. So back to what Matt said, if we would provide the details of how many visitors, that would be more of the output. But as far as the policy is concerned, we're saying we're compliant because we're able to facilitate the movement of visitors within the service area.
So just so I can understand it, is the policy written in a way that it's impossible for staff to be able to provide support? I'm trying to get back to what our role at policy, if what we've asked in the policy can't be supported through actual data, what you can point to is there's a bus stop in front of the ticket office at Yoast, therefore we think somebody might actually be going to the hockey game. Does the policy need to get revisited? Because I don't want to put staff in a position if it's not possible to respond. That's the question. Or if there's 2 times a year surveys, would that not be sufficient to provide as a response? I'm not trying to make this too difficult. I'm saying if there is information, that would be great to have it, just so that we understand how ridership is being rebuilt. It's being rebuilt on several levels: visitors and workers and residents, and it's being rebuilt in a number of ways. And the more data staff can get for itself in its marketing efforts, not just for us as a board, but as a staff, those are strategy areas. And maybe we're not building as much for the daycare centers, but we are building with workers. So that's an area of growth. It's either give us what you have and let's make sure the policy writes it in a way that you can do that, or if it's not possible, it's going to be much too expensive. Maybe that's an assignment for us as a board to revisit how we've written the policy. It feels like we're somewhere in the middle of the two, that the provision of service isn't the same thing as having impact. If we're saying we're facilitating labor mobility, but only 3% of our workers are using transit, we're not really having as much impact. There's got to be other data points that document the impact. And I'm trying to figure out if it's on us to take another look at our policy, or if the data that does exist may not be perfect, but it's still something.
There's a lot of ground there. And I think it does get to the question of, is this an interpretation question? Is this a future policy writing question? So I'll try to work backwards and unpack it. I will note that I'm thankful that your new policy governance consultant will be introducing yourself later tonight, because we're starting to get a little the water's getting up close to my nose here in terms of my ability to articulate this. I'll also say that next month I'm planning to come forward to you guys to talk a little more about using market segmentation to rebuild ridership. So you're reading my mind again, exactly for these purposes. In this case, you're being asked to judge the interpretation, the degree of compliance, is the evidence satisfactory. This has always been a matter for us about how much detail is good enough. And that's something only the board can decide, is my understanding. And this organization, we've kind of leaned back and forth over that line over the last few years. Some of you may remember years ago, we had voluminous reports trying to get down to that level of detail, and everyone hated trying to read them. So we scaled them back up to sort of the highest level information that the board could find acceptable. This particular interpretation, I think, has roughly been the same for several years, in part because it seemed to hit, a sweet spot for the board that this was good enough. Yes, it's an output measure. Yes, it measures the service provision, as Rosa was saying, that we have service where visitors would go or how they would enter the community. And further than that, yeah, we could go further than that in terms of data collection, but at increasing cost and sort of a diminishing point of return. We can do onboard surveys every year. I could do them every week to nail this one to the wall, but it's ungodly expensive. So we've kind of triangulated and settled that this is good enough for judging the past. If the board feels like it's no longer good enough, that the interpretation of service provision, we really need an outcome measure. Output doesn't cut it anymore. Then I think that is a monitoring report issue, not a written policy issue. I would have to, defer to other people later today, but that's where I was kind of going with some of this stuff. Is that a monitoring issue, or is that a future policy issue, and maybe some things to work through going forward? And just as a close, 3% is actually really good for a community our size, but I didn't give you that context, so how would you know? So maybe that's the context that could be provided to help. Sometimes we don't even think about it, right? We live this stuff and we don't think oh yeah, otherwise this looks bad. So thank you for raising that.
Thank you. Richard?
Thank you. So this is actually my favorite monitoring report because in the end, and it is really what we're setting for the CEO to hit. And so for me, I actually expect us to never be fully compliant, because actually if we have a whole bunch of greens, I don't think we're doing our job as a board. And so I think what I was going to get out of that is it ties into actually what Jesse and Susan have already brought to light, is that I think now, like for me, I'm actually fine with their interpretations of what Matt has provided to us, but I think it's our job then to go, in particular, especially the ones that have green dots, like do we need to set some different targets, right? So is it more some hard targets for interpretation, like some of the comments talked about, well, what is an acceptable increase in ridership? And actually, when Jesse made that comment about 1.0, I am actually not really happy with their interpretation that Matt gave for that, because one thing I love about the AAATA is that we don't like to really follow the rest, and we set the bar high for ourselves, not just as a board, the staff, and the leadership. And if everyone else around us is cratering, I want to see if we can actually figure out how to not follow that same trend. And if for some reason that there are economic forces or whatever that affect us, where it causes an impact on financials or our ridership, yeah, we're not going, like the CEO is probably going to say, like, we have not achieved compliance, but he can give us a reasonable timeline as to what, or interpretation, and also a timeline as to when he thinks that may be resolved, whether it's in their control or not. And I think it's up to us as a board to accept that. And so I wasn't super thrilled with the interpretation, like, well, we kind of have to go this way because there's a lot of stuff out of control. I think that's fine, but I think we set some targets. So I think the only ask I have for the board is, I don't know what next steps would be for us, and maybe just go through, not tonight, because I think we all want to go home and get to bed at some point, but maybe identify which one of these in particular, especially the ones that are greens, that we want to target for some evaluation on our side of whatever these hard targets are for interpretation, whatever that means.
If I can interject real quick, Rich, you brought up a really good point. On our monitoring schedule, 2025, which is next year, is the time there we are going to be looking at the entirety of the ends. I believe it was 2018, maybe 2019, when we had a board retreat and all we did was focus in on the ends and we wrote them and we really took a hard look at everything. So I don't know that we have the bandwidth this year. This is definitely a board decision, not mine, but I did want to call it to your attention that it is on the workload for next year, and it's maybe I shouldn't have assumed, but I thought that it would look a lot like what it looked like in the past, where we would take at least a half a day or a day long looking at the ends and really diving into them. But that's a board decision for us to look into. Matt, did you have any response for Rich? I sort of just jumped in there.
If I think if I'm hearing Rich correctly, he would find a report of non-compliance on a more aggressive target more satisfying than compliance, but I don't control all the factors. Is that roughly where you were going? Okay.
To clarify also, it's just like, I don't know if it's an ends, 'cause I mean, in my view, the ends are typically going to be very high level statements. So I think it's more just on the policy level where we have to kind of set. So I feel like the policies roll up into this ends report in the end. And so maybe some of these policies, we actually need to like drill down into them and be like, okay, they've been a little too, I don't know, moldable. And maybe we can put some guardrails in those cases. Like,
So if
hey, we want 3% growth year over year or something.
So I'm hearing you correctly then. It sounds like rather than drill down on the ends themselves, you're seeing an opportunity for policy development in the executive limitation area. And that would be an area that you think the board would be best served on looking into. Did I hear that correctly?
I think that is what I want, but I don't know if that's an appropriate matter. So it's
Fair.
great that we have our PGC here to set us straight afterwards. So, but yes, what Matt's interpretation of what I said and then what you just said is what I am aiming for. The process to do that, I'm not 100% sure, but we'd love to help.
Fair enough. Are there any other comments? I have two. Oh, sorry, Mike. Gotta raise it up higher.
I just wanted to briefly reinforce some things that have been said earlier, particularly by Susan. And particularly, it's easier to take 1.3.3 as an example, and we've already discussed that. But I'll just say my thoughts here, and I'll try to be very brief. I mean, it says visitors use public transportation, but the interpretation just addresses access, and that bothers me. And particularly, it's the statement, there's no way of knowing whether passengers are visitors, that statement in there. And you explained a little bit later that you think that your existing resources are not really adequate to address this in a good way. You know more about surveys than, of course, I do, but it just seems like we should do more surveys and not necessarily, and in different places too. I mean, we've got the train station. A lot of those people are visitors. Of course, we've got DTW. Those are pretty much all visitors. Already mentioned the football games. And maybe there's some other things that we can do other than surveys. And just thinking out loud, particularly if we do more outreach to visitors to try to promote transportation options to visitors. And maybe part of that might even be in something that would, again, allow us to track things better. If we had a visitor's bus pass, or discount pass for visitors. Boy, that way we should be able to attract visitors pretty well. I know it's complicated and probably expensive to put another kind of a discount in our system, but I think it's something that could be considered. Another thought that I had is, Destination Ann Arbor job is, and they have a lot of money to promote visitors to Ann Arbor. And I would think that maybe there could be some kind of a cooperative effort where they could help fund things to promote the use of public transportation to visitors.
Matt, did you want to respond?
A couple of observations. So I look forward to coming forward to you guys starting next month, hopefully, to start talking about how we want to work on building ridership. But that's in the future. The monitoring report is about the past, and it's about compliance with the policy. So I need to try to help keep us keeping those two things separate. I appreciate Mike's comments, and I appreciate this discussion, because I think this is, in some of the past years, we've kind of glossed over some of the ends interpretations and the evidence, and you've been accepting them pretty consistently, and I appreciated that. You're really drilling down into some important space today in terms of outputs and outcomes, and is this data satisfactory? If you guys have this latitude to simply say the interpretation is not reasonable, the evidence isn't good enough, and you've touched on some things today that maybe you think that that's where you want to go today, that's fine. That's your purview as the board. If you did that, I'd go back and say, okay, how can we get a little closer to that? And I think that's sort of the iterative, generative process that's built into here. What it would take to do that, I don't know. So I'd probably need to think about it and come back to you about how long it would take to redo these interpretations and how much it would actually cost to get the data you're suggesting. And I'd probably ask you questions like, visitors are important. How much are you willing to pay to get a tremendous degree of precision on this? If they are 1% of the riders, how much do you want to drop on that? That's the kind of questions we'll kind of eventually get at, because absolutely, I could post a surveyor at the Amtrak station and just count every day who gets on the bus. We can do that. It's just money. And yeah, those sorts of, we can get that precision, but it comes at a cost. And that's sort of the reference here in terms of this degree of evidence has been acceptable in past, partially based on the cost of gathering the data. If that's not as compelling as it was before, we can take a step back and explore it.
Did you? Okay, thank you, Matt. I just have one thing that I wanted to talk about, and that is, Matt, you raised a really good point about a data point for 1.1.2, which is, I'm sorry, one moment. Accessibility 1.1, where we were talking about sidewalks and that your target date is 2033. I appreciate your valor in wanting to be 100% compliant, but it goes back to something you spoke about in regards to another policy that was in here, in that accessible bus stops can only occur when there is an accessible sidewalk adjacent. So in other words, if you have a bus stop that's in a grassy area and there's no connecting sidewalk, there's no way to put a pad there. It doesn't make economic sense. But we also do not have control over how the municipalities install their sidewalks. That's just not within our control. And so for me as a board member, when I hear you set the bar at 100%, for me, I would tweak it a little and say 100% of bus stops that have adjacent sidewalks or that are able to be, because again, that is something that is out of our control, and that might be something that never gets hit ever, especially if we increase service and we're going out to other areas that are more rural. There will not be sidewalks. Therefore, how can we make those accessible? So just to answer the question that you posed to the board, I might, if I were you and Rosa Maria, I would reconsider what 100% means and maybe relook at that, because I don't know that you're ever going to hit that target with the way that you're describing it now.
Thank you. And this is something that we've discussed, I think, several times, and it is always an incredibly confusing point, because the Americans with Disabilities Act, we can only make improvements at a bus stop if we bring it up to ADA compliance, which means an accessible path of travel. If there is no sidewalk nearby, for example, if you're in a rural area, and it's just a drainage ditch, there's no sidewalk to connect to. I can't legally make any investment in that bus stop other than planting a pole and a sign. We try to capture this, and you'll see it in the interpretation. If you look on page 34, point D, we try to clarify that we're only talking about stops near sidewalks.
Okay.
So the 100% goal, we're already not talking about 100% of the 1,100 bus stops. I think we're talking about 100% of maybe 800 bus stops that are in proximity to a sidewalk. My comments earlier about even that subset of only the bus stops near a sidewalk, that's going to take us until 2033. Am I going to report partial compliance on this entire policy because of that? Even if we're making great progress every year, I may need to walk my interpretation back to, we're on schedule for 2033, or we're doing at least 10 a year, or some other interpretation where, because frankly, it's a little depressing for staff to put it on the board and just be like, nope, didn't get it this year, didn't get it this year. And then in 2034, it's 100%, and then it's irrelevant. But to Kathleen's longer, broader purpose, all of those other bus stops that are not near sidewalks, we keep an eye on what the municipalities are planning to do. And if there's any hint of sidewalk development, we kind of side on up to them and be like, hey, I hear you're pouring concrete. Would you, can we throw a little extra money and you pour a sidewalk to the bus stop? And we make an effort to try to do that. So we keep an eye on it. The ultimate goal is 100% of all of them, but do we need the sidewalk there?
Yeah, fair enough. Any other questions or comments? Jesse?
So, board members have brought up a couple of things which would make me wonder if we wanted to identify those policies interpretations as unreasonable. The two that I caught were 1.0, which Rich and I spoke of, and then 133, visitors use public transportation in the area. I think, as far as, so I kind of felt like those were 2 points that haven't really been, contested by board members. You haven't really had any discussion on it, but I'm kind of wondering, maybe just to take a board temperature check, like, do we want to identify those as an unreasonable interpretation so that we have clearly expressed our expectations to staff? Because I think it's one thing to kind of talk about it, but then if we vote to accept it as written, then we haven't really effectively communicated anything. So I guess I am personally inclined to support accepting this as proposed, with the exception of 1.0 and 133, at which I would find the interpretation unreasonable, but I'm curious what other board members think.
For me, I look to the percentages and what has already been said. We've already taken the survey and we're looking at the survey as a whole. It says that 88% agreed with those policies, which is more than quorum. However, I also know Mr. Carpenter and Rosa Maria. I don't believe that they say, okay, well, everything was good and we're just going to go back home. We're going to throw this in a drawer and we're done. I do believe that they look at our comments as he so thoughtfully brought forward earlier tonight. And I don't believe that, number one, that it's going to get dropped. Number two, I have a hard time with changing an output or an outcome that's already been settled in writing. We have already said what we needed to say in our survey. I think that we can say additional things, and we certainly have a different concurrence, but I also want to respect the fact that we have already, the board has already spoken. If we want to walk it back, I don't know how appropriate that is. I think it may be more beneficial to, this is really a governance consultant question because it's not something that's ever been asked before. And I know that we have not introduced her. I don't know if it's, if we want to revisit. Yes, Jesse.
So I guess I would disagree that the board has spoken. I think board members have spoken, but the board has not yet spoken, that we speak with our vote. And all of these things are things that individual board members did put out in the survey. I don't think there's been any new information presented. And so this is the decision to decide what the board itself is going to say. And so I feel like the points have been made. Having heard the discussion, I'm inclined to agree with the points that other individual board members have made and would like to put it out there for that to be the expression of the board.
Then at this point, the most appropriate thing to do would be to make that motion.
Right.
In the exact format that you would like to have it. Let's see if it gets seconded and if it runs through the board. Then, of course, it's the board's decision.
guess I
But
just
it
want-
can't be done without the motion, I guess is where I'm going. So if you'd like to make that motion? Yes.
I also disagree with what you said, Kathleen, when I don't usually disagree with you. But I don't think and I'm agreeing with Jesse, I don't think the board has spoken. Just because people at one point in time when they filled out the form thought one way, if they hear discussion and opens up new thoughts for them and can decide otherwise, I think it's very appropriate that we vote, and we can certainly change. This is not cast in stone what people filled out.
No, I agree.
So, yeah,
I do agree with you, and that is why I changed my presentation and why I said that maybe it needs to move forward in a motion. If I misspoke or misrepresented policy governance in any way, that's my apology to the board.
So would you prefer that, so I was asking to discuss that. Would you prefer that we discuss it, like that we discuss an active motion? I wasn't going to do that, but if you would feel better that we actually discuss a motion on the table, I'm happy to make that motion.
Robert's rules specifically said the motion goes, someone seconds the motion, and then we will have discussion on that motion. I don't think it's appropriate for us to continue this discussion about what the board might want to do. Put the official motion on the board and let's see where it falls out.
Okay, well then, I would like to move that we accept the report as written, or as proposed by the CEO, with the exception of policies 1.0 and 1.3.3, where we find the interpretation of those policies to be unreasonable.
And that is C.
I mean, I feel like with that, I could actually write down how I find every single policy, but if you give me a minute.
No, okay.
I was summarizing.
No, that's brilliant. I agree with that. And that keeps it very simple. So Jesse has a motion on the floor. Would you repeat it?
Yeah, so I guess I would say accept it as C, where all policies are accepted in general as the CEO has proposed, with the exceptions of 1.0 and 1.3.3, which we find to the interpretation to be unreasonable.
Very good. Do we have a second? That was, you have support from Mike. All those in favor?
Discussion.
Oh, I'm sorry. Thank you. Can we start discussion on the motion, please? And Rich, that would be you. I apologize.
No worries. Yeah, so I think this is that continual debate that we always have, like, are we looking at the past or the future? And I think there's like this weird line that none of us know where it is. Because for me, I was actually gonna say, I'm okay with this as is, but I would like us as the board to determine what we can do, for instance, with 1.0 and 1.3.3, that gets us to the point that the interpretation that Matt gives us hits the target that we're looking for. Because I agree, like, it's a little muddy, but I don't know like what Matt's gonna be able to do if he goes back and gives us a different. I'd rather we look to the future and say, okay, we gotta modify those particular policies that gives Matt some targets that he has to hit that we will all accept, or a majority of us will accept as reasonable at that point.
Jesse?
So I think this is how we do that, you know, that the CEO puts out his interpretation of our policy. And I don't think there's anything wrong with, well, with 1.0, I don't think there's anything wrong with it. That you and I both interpreted that, you know, our interpretation of it is that ridership goes up. And the CEO's interpretation is different from that. And I guess I am kind of in, you know, I am inclined as an individual board member to say I find that interpretation unreasonable and to express that to the CEO. And that's, I guess, where I kind of want to put out, if you feel like if other board members feel like his interpretation is reasonable, then I'm just one vote. But the board as a whole says, no, that is a reasonable interpretation, and we move forward. Now, I might say 133, I think the conversation about outcomes versus output is interesting because that is one where we say, you know, we did not say that visitors have access to public transportation options. We said that visitors use, that is very specific. And so I actually feel like that the interpretation is actually quite unreasonable because this is a pretty explicit policy that maybe if we think that should have, maybe we want to rewrite that policy to say that visitors have access to, because we feel that's something that we have more control over. But that's a second step. But I think, so that, I guess that would be my response to that, is that my personal feeling is that the interpretation of 1.0 is unreasonable. I don't think that's what the board meant. And in 1.3, likewise, I think that's not what the board meant by saying visitors use public transportation.
Susan?
I was going to also add to the list one other, and this is one where I think Matt was harsh on himself.
If I may, right now we're talking about this motion and that discussion.
I was
If the
looking to
motion
add
doesn't-
one.
We would amend the emotion that,
Okay.
amend the motion.
Got it.
So are you calling for an amendment of the amendment?
Yes, I wanted to add 1.2.3 and make it partially compliant as opposed to completely non-compliant. That seemed overly harsh. As long as we were examining some for compliance, I felt that the reason it was made non-compliant was very forward-looking, that we in the future will have a public policy program, and we don't have that yet. Whereas I think this year, I felt staff did a really good job bringing to policymakers significant changes. So to the two that were noted, I was asking if we could add a third for modification.
So Susan is asking us to amend the amendment as proposed by Jesse. Is there any discussion on that?
So you're moving to amend the motion to include 1.2.3? And, okay, so then someone would need to second it? Second her motion?
Yes. Is there somebody who'd like to second Susan's amendment of the amendment that is on the table? Do we have a second? If we don't have a second, that motion is dead. Okay, very good. So we go back to Jesse's original motion. Is there any other discussion on that motion? If not, we've had a motion, we've had a second, so now it is appropriate time to take a vote. All those in favor of the amendment as the motion as he is presented, will we raise your hands, please? All right, and it passes. 1, 2, 3, 4, 5, 6, and we have 6 yeses and 2 noes. Is that what? Oh, Susan, I thought I kept seeing this.
hate to do this. Jesse, please remind me again what
Oh.
the specific language that will help me.
So the motion on the table is to accept the report as C, and then to summarize that all policies are accepted as proposed by the CEO, with the exception of 1.0 and 1.3.3, where we find the interpretation unreasonable.
Kyra?
Just one more thing before we vote again. I'm going to vote no for this motion, but the reason is because when we think about our role as far as any reasonable interpretation, I think that threshold has been passed. And I prefer that when we evaluate the ends, when that comes, that we kind of we usually look at the, more recent monitoring reports and have that perspective going into our evaluation of the end. So that is my perspective procedurally on how we can address this going forward. And I think that the discussion is healthy because it's always interesting what we come down to as far as any reasonable interpretation, but I'm satisfied that the CEO has done that.
Very good. Is there any other further discussion? Jesse, would you please be patient with us? Repeat it one more time so that when we're
happy to.
taking the vote, we're all very clear.
Okay. So the motion is to accept the report as C. And again, to summarize, we will accept all proposals by the CEO as proposed, with the exception of 1.0 and 1.3.3, which we find the interpretation of the policy to be unreasonable.
All those in favor of the motion, please raise your hand. We have 4, and we have 4.
We should count opposed.
Pardon?
Could we ask for all opposed? Is there any
Oh, all
abstentions?
opposed? Are there? We are now at a stalemate.
But the chair breaks the tie.
I break the tie, so it doesn't pass.
Yes.
Okay, thank you. Fair enough. So would someone like to make an additional motion about the ends report and how to accept it? Yes, Kyra?
I make a motion to accept the monitoring report as option B. What is the language? Reasonable interpretation except for the items noted.
Is there any discussion on the motion that Kyra has just put forth? Second, please. Seconded by Rich. Is there any discussion on this current motion that's on the table? Seeing no discussion, we will go ahead and take a vote. All those in favor of the motion that Kyra just put on the table, please raise your hands. We have 5 yeses, all opposed. 3 opposed, the motion carries. Thank you, everyone, for all of your hard work and trying to get my skill building in there. Thank you so much. Very good. All right, then we're going to go ahead and move on to ID and compensation.
Chair, could I ask for a brief recess? Or
Yes, sir, of course.
Thank you.
All those in favor of a quick recess? Very good. Let's just go. We're back. Thank you so much for your patience. And we are going to move on in the agenda. Thank you, everyone, for that hearty discussion. It was very educational, and I also think that it speaks to the fact that this board is a working board, that we really do care about our jobs and how we present and how we take care of the agency. So thank you for all of that. It might have been a little bit difficult, but we made it through. Next on our agenda is the ID and compensation under policy. And the reason that this is in here now, let me get there one moment. So the board, our ID badges, they're sort of like they came back into our lives after not being in our lives for a period of time. And so I know that when I received my first ID, it was so that I could access the Blake Transit Center for service committee meetings. But I was not aware that the ID pass also acted as a boarding pass for fixed route. And so that has something that has just come to light very recently. And so that's why this discussion is coming before the board now, because, and especially because Susan raised a very good point last time. She was talking about ridership and engaging, and then Jesse said, ride the bus. So it all sort of happened organically, and I want to get us all on the same page about what a board ID is and what it is not. And so it's really clear that in our policies, we have lots of governing policies in regards to our job descriptions, our governing styles, our board code of conduct, our cost of governance, and we also have articles in our articles of incorporation where it's been discussed. And so what is important to note is, and I'm sure everyone has read this, do I need to go into greater detail before? Okay. So what it's about is that because these bus passes or these IDs, so it looks like this, we all have these, you just show it to the bus driver and you can ride the bus. So to do things like come to a board meeting, to go to a committee meeting, to go to public engagement, to specifically maybe pick a day and say, you know what, I'm going to go out and ride the buses because I want to meet the public and I want to see what's happening. Those are all part of your job descriptions. They're all part of normal business, and please use them. I think it's a wonderful and great tool. Where we get into a little bit of a snafu is that these passes are not for personal use. They're not just for, I don't have money in my pocket and I need to go to the store and I'm going to go ahead and use my board pass. It's because it bumps up against Article 4 in the governing body officers, Section 2, the very last phrase where it says, members of the board shall serve without compensation, but may be reimbursed for expenses. And so by using the board pass for things other than board members, then that crosses the line into compensation. And so it was just important to have this discussion to get everybody on the same page so that as we move forward, we're all following procedure and not doing anything that might cause some sort of damage or harm. It's more informational. It's not anything that needs to be voted upon. However, I would like to open it up if anyone should have any questions for myself or also Mr. Carpenter, because he's the one who had the foresight to bring the ID badges back. So. Yes, Susan.
This is less about the value of the card and using it in our off hours, but rather I want to use it as a chance to stand on a soapbox and urge all of us to ride the bus as often as we can. We serve in a policy role, but I don't know that we can do good policy if we are not actually ourselves users, regular users. And that means weekends, evenings. So I know it goes into that whole area. If I'm using it to go have lunch with a friend, am I actually riding the bus in my role? I would argue that more times than not it is. There are very few roles for community members, I think, where we have as much impact as we do on this board. And I think the best way to serve would be to be very knowledgeable as often as possible to ride this bus system. And I would argue other bus systems. If you're in other towns, ride other buses, use the blue buses. I think the more we are transit users, the better we can be transit policymakers. So I'm glad this is here. I had raised this question when I first joined. And again, on my soapbox, I hope my fellow board members will join me in becoming regular users of the bus system.
Thank you. Any other comments or questions? Jesse?
I just want to reiterate, I might actually send this out. There was a report done about a year or two ago that demonstrated that nationwide transit board members very rarely are representative of their ridership, and that they do not use services. They are not generally, they don't match the socioeconomic or racial or gender makeup of their cities. I think, from what I can tell, this board is much more representative than other transit agencies. But I would love for us to be a board of transit users. And as a daily, I fortunately don't have to worry about my employer pays for my bus fare. And I know that a lot of Ann Arbor employers pay for their transit use, and for that, I'm very grateful. But I'm learn much more about the system and the needs of the riders by using it than anything else I do.
No, and those are very, very good points, Jesse. It's more of an honor system. So, you know your heart and you know what you're doing when you're on those buses. And I know for a fact that you are engaging because I have had members of the public say, I ride the board with Jesse and Simi, or I ride the bus. So I know that it's happening. I think it's just more speaks to, we don't want to get to the point where we're not engaging if we're going to use the bus pass, that we just look at it, it's not for us to say, I'm going to go to work every single day and I'm going to put my head in the paper, but I'm going to use, you know what I mean? It's more, but it's not policed either. We're just asking that we're mindful of how we use them and just sort of resetting the standard, because again, it wasn't around for such a long period of time. It was just time to sort of get a refresh. So thank you, everyone. Next on our agenda is 6.1, zero emission bus decision, and that is Mr. Matt Carpenter.
Back again. Okay, thank you, Madam Chair, board members. Following up on December's discussion of zero emissions buses and proposals that had continued to evolve even as we got to December, I'm here today for what I had threatened to do in terms of the first of a two-step authorization process. For the benefit of our visitors, there are some, I will say that normally a CEO under policy governance is not required to get board approval for grant submissions. There are policies that interact with this, and in this particular case, I do need your authorization. So as I go through here, I'm going to be referencing certain policies that are important here that sort of shape the confines of this decision. So I want to thank you guys for bearing with us as this conversation has been going. We were really forming and storming in October and November. I felt like in December we began norming. We had a bit of a breakthrough there. The proposal was retooled a little bit to be more aggressive on emissions reductions from this proposal. And it also coincidentally began to resolve some of the broader financial concerns with the approach by including, and the scope hasn't changed, just to be clear, from what we were talking about in December. A hydrogen bus, two-bus project is what I'm starting to call a learning rollout, that we're bringing in two buses so that we can learn how to use hydrogen fuel cell technology on the assumption that that's going to be what we start buying for zero emissions as soon as practical. But in the meantime, begin to phase out the conventional diesels with hybrid buses to begin reducing the emissions as quickly as we can. And that because of the very generous grant opportunities that exist for that might actually help us free up some capital funding elsewhere in our budget to help pay for other things. So that seemed to be sort of the magic trick that helped us have a bit of a breakthrough in December. I don't presume that everyone's completely satisfied, so I'm not assuming you're all on board, but I saw a lot of heads nodding. And so as we go into this, I'm feeling optimistic. So this two-stage approval process exists in part to test that assumption by putting you guys to making a vote on something to say, okay, are we there? It also exists because under certain policies in your policy manual, under certain situations, I do need your approval to submit a grant. This is under policy 210 that it pertains to construction in particular. When that policy was developed, it foresaw that construction decisions have a very large impact on the finances of the agency. We're building something that's a very permanent commitment. The board wanted to have a little more direct control over those things. So you listed a number of things in policy 210 that I cannot submit a grant application without your authorization, and you laid out specifically, here's the information we want to see when you come to us for authorization. So that's what's in your packet. There is a little bit of a caveat here. There's only a small part of this overall strategy that is actually construction. The hydrogen buses require a fueling station, which is a thing that needs to be constructed. When I looked at my own interpretation, I did draw a line. I said, you know, it's not construction if it doesn't change the envelope of a building, which this doesn't, or material, I said something to the effect, materially affects the function of the structure. And I said, you know, I could argue maybe on this point, but I'd rather just, on the overabundance of caution, I'm going to put it to the board and make you guys vote on it and just assume that the fueling station qualifies as a material change, and therefore I need your approval. So it's the fueling station that compels me to come forward to seek your approval before I submit a grant authorization. But then in discussions with Dina and Rosa, we ran into the complication of, well, hybrids don't require any construction at all. It's part of the reason we like the hybrids is there's a low risk because we got everything we need already. That part doesn't, but then it became a very convoluted 3-step process of approval, and we'd package these things together. So what you're receiving in your packet here is the proposals that we've talked about most recently in December, hydrogen plus the hybrids, brought together against the things you wanted to see for construction. So even the non-construction elements are addressed here, again, out of an overabundance of caution, just to make sure we're not also confusing ourselves about which part of this proposal is in and out. The construction policy forces me to, you ask good questions in there, it forces me to bring good information. So we figured, let's just throw it all in there and hopefully the board's okay with that. So I would like to walk you through a little bit of this, just highlights again, not going to dwell on it, but then open it up for your questions and discussions. And I will refer to a couple of policy loose threads that crop up in here again. If we were to look at page 64, you find the relevant policy and the things that you said you needed me to bring, the questions I needed to answer for you if I came forward seeking grant approval. What is the nature of, item A, what is the nature of the project? Literally, what is it? So it's what we've said before, same scope, 2 hydrogen fuel cell buses and associated equipment, 1 outdoor fueling station, workforce training, 12 months of operation in all seasons. That's, we said there's 2 parts. That's the zero emissions part. The low emissions part, the hybrid buses. What are the most important elements? Description of how the project will advance specific goals. You see some references to the environmental sustainability policy 211 below there. The one thing that's a bit of a loose thread here, I want to draw your attention to, and point 2. We have not nailed down yet the exact number of hybrid buses we think we should ask for. And you may recall in December, we showed you data that said if it were 4 buses, this is what the financial impact would be. It was pretty good. And one of you, and it might have been Simi, asked, well, what about 8? And you may recall that 8 is sort of the ceiling. That's what we naturally try to shoot for in replacements. So we have more work to do. I apologize. We weren't able to get that number nailed down. What we're presenting to you here for your consideration is the ceiling of 8. So this is sort of the largest financial benefit and impact. In subsequent tables, you'll see it that way. But we may ultimately come back to you later for a lower number, maybe 6, maybe 7. I want to explain just for a moment why that number hasn't been nailed down yet. We don't want to overshoot the grant and ask for so much money that we get laughed out of the room. We don't want to undershoot the grant and leave money on the table. So there's a little triangulation. We need to get some advice from people who've won. We need to look at other awardees and try to figure out where the sweet spot is. We also want to make sure that we don't overcommit the capital reserve. You may recall that there's only a finite amount of money in there right now. A lot of that presently is looking, the YTC kind of has precedent for that at the moment, although the spending for that is several years away. We want to make sure we don't double commit the same capital reserve dollar in there. So that's just, again, an overabundance of caution. So we may move that number down for this particular grant, and this brings up an additional complication. If you approve, this grant submission and the next step, and we submit the grant and we win, which again would probably be, by the end of September, we're going to keep looking for every other pot of money under the sun to help pay for this project and the YTC as well. Like, none of that stops. It keeps going. Just today, Dina and I spoke with another municipality who's approached us about maybe we should partner up on, because we're talking about hydrogen, they're talking about hydrogen. Maybe we buddy up and go after a different grant altogether than what we've discussed here. So this raises a lot of questions about how we're going to be pursuing grant funding. And the way this is written is that you're authorizing us to pursue grants, but not necessarily a specific one. That gives us the freedom and latitude to go after the best possible pot of money that could come up. The presentation we got today was very preliminary. I don't know how we feel about it. We haven't had a chance to talk. But we need to think through that. We may have opportunities to, so for example, go after 4 buses through one grant program and go after the other 4 buses through another grant program. So specifically how we get this number to you, that number is not nailed down yet. We're going to bring that to you probably in the next stage of this approval. But we said, let's go to the largest financial impact for the tables that are in here so that you see the high end of what that implication could be. I hope that makes sense. I know it's very complicated. There's a lot of moving parts on the grant side of it. So moving along to page 65, you see this graph that we've seen before in the presentations. This gives you the big picture context about the vision for the fleet's propulsion systems. That it is the vision to move towards zero emissions, using hybrids as a bridging strategy, and to help us phase out the conventional diesels sooner. So I just wanted to reiterate that this is still the expectation. This is what we discussed with you in December. This is still the plan. Everything that's in here is what we discussed in December. The public involvement section here, I hope if you want to read that, you can. It's not a major part of this project. Relative priority, I've said it's important, but maybe not as important as some other things. You can agree or not with that. And then we get to, I think, the heart of part of this is the section D, the fiscal responsibility. How much does it cost? Where is the money coming from? This is where you start to see sort of we've put in for 8 buses to sort of show you the largest possible financial impact and what that would look like here. Below that, towards starting at the bottom of page 66, you see the funding assumptions. How much of this would be coming from federal grants? Again, it's somewhat dependent on which grants we go after. The one we've talked the most about is the low-no grant, where it's 80 cents on the dollar. That's the one that gives us the biggest bang for the buck on the hybrids. And that is still, frankly, 99% of our attention is on that. We've had considerable conversations on how to win that grant. Turning the page to 67, you see a placeholder about the state, and then some comments about the capital reserve on item 3. Now, this gets into other policies that you have. There is a policy that, policy 257, that prohibits me from using the capital reserve without your express permission. And you have under your own job description 3212, you retain the right to decide whether or not the capital reserve can be used. So I want to be clear about this because I've gotten some feedback from some of you already that this is a little unclear. We are not asking you to authorize money today. We actually don't have the details yet, so I can't. We're going just down what you needed to see in the construction grant so that we can, or the construction policies, so that I can submit the grant. But what we're trying to do here is, we know in the future, we're very likely to have to ask you to tap the capital reserve. That's probably a year away. So this is a courtesy heads up with a big flashing sign. Hey guys, this is your responsibility to approve this. We're letting you know well in advance. We're probably going to need to tap this thing. Specific amount to be determined. A good example of why that's hard to nail down, in addition to the number of buses and which grant are we going to, the feds can also negotiate with us. They can come back and say, hey, you asked for 8, how about 6? So we don't actually know the final number that we would need to ask you to authorize to remove from the reserve. So we are not asking you today, I want to be clear, that is not part of what this is. We're not asking you to authorize removal of anything from the reserve. All of this today is simply, are you satisfied with the answers to the construction policy enough for giving us authorization to submit the grant? That's all this is about. Okay, the finances here reflect some of the tables and discussions that we've seen before. You see the general budget implication that tapping this money would free up other funds internally that we can then deploy to other capital projects. Point 5 on page 67, millage impact. That was something you specifically asked for. I'm happy to tell you there is none. We don't tend to use millage money for this project at all. That was never a part of the equation. It has no impact on the millage services whatsoever. If I might backtrack just a moment, our public commenter at the beginning of the meeting said, unless the money's changed, or unless the technology has changed, the hybrids, the legacy hybrids were part of our financial challenges 10 years ago. I'm happy to report to you, as we discussed in December, both of those factors did change. The very generous grants for hybrids did come back. It's probably even more generous than it was before. And the technology mightily improved. And I think that was something we spent some time discussing in December. So I am happy to resolve that question. Risks. And there's a section you had asked, tell us about the risks, and you'll see the answers in here. Most of the operational and service risks here, we think we've mitigated and resolved, largely by the size of the hydrogen purchase, that we're not going all in. It's a learning opportunity, and that allows us to limit our exposure to, for example, escalating hydrogen prices. We have the opportunity, there's only 2, and frankly, we could just slow down the amount of time they're on the road if the budget came under pressure. We could manage that risk in that way. Operational risk, a nice thing about the hybrids is they present almost no operational risk. We have all the equipment and training already that we need. We'll supplement that a little bit more, especially on the training side, but they take diesel fuel. You have a diesel pump. It's pretty straightforward. Socio-political, economic, there's generally benefits here. You asked for what other risks exist, and I racked my brain to think about, what if we not already talked to death? And you're bored of hearing, there's one more thing I don't think have hit on clearly, and that's the growing field of regulating hydrogen tanks. We're getting way down in the weeds here, but in discussions with the city of Ann Arbor, we found no regulations or building codes that really pertain to compressed liquid hydrogen storage tanks, because it's relatively new. They don't have any in the city to date, as far as we know. The only regulation we could find is that it can't be too close to the rail track behind our garage. That's a federal thing. Other than that, none. I want you to know, from a mitigation point of view, we have talked extensively with the head of planning, and I think codes, they have not raised any flags and effectively said we would be grandfathered in. They are lumping us in with other government utilities, which have a special consideration under the building codes. So that doesn't seem to be a huge problem, but you said, tell us any other risk, and so I want to make sure we're doing our due diligence there. Timelines, walking down the list here, you can see some of these. A couple of changes based on things we've talked about before. The federal money, I believe, has been approved. The FTA will probably be bringing out the grant applications in the next few weeks. We expect, the grant deadlines to probably be March and April. The one thing I think is, maybe a little disappointing about this, about halfway down, in terms of the delivery timelines, third bullet from the bottom, it's actually gotten worse. Previously, I think we were saying about 24 months. Now we're hearing 24 to 36. So we're now 2 to 3 years out for some of this equipment. This is not a Michigan problem. This is a national problem. Everybody is here. What has happened, I think 2 things. First, as you may recall, there were 3 bus manufacturers in the country: Gillig, New Flyer, and Nova. Nova was who we were using. They've backed out of the market. Everybody has now redistributed their demand to the 2 remaining suppliers. So their order books are starting to fill up. So that's part of it. The other thing, there seems to be a rapidly growing interest in hydrogen fuel cell technology. I don't know if batteries are dropping off. I think there's still a great deal of interest in that technology, but a lot of people are coming for hydrogen, and there's only 2 manufacturers who do that. So it is definitely increasing orders in that capacity. We want to be clear with you just on what we're hearing, that this is what we're hearing. Optimistically, I've seen these, they will fluctuate again. By the time we get in the queue, it might not be this bad. More capacity may come online. Other customers may change. Things like this happen. So, but we wanted to be upfront with you about, something that I know it startled me when I saw this earlier this month. I was like, that's worse than it was before, isn't it? And Troy's like, yeah. So that was a disappointment. Is what it is. I think that completes the rundown of the information that you requested in the construction policy before proceeding with the grant authorization. My request to you this evening is by vote to authorize me, I think it says so in the motion, to submit grants pertaining to this scope and this project. How did I word it? By motion, authorize the CEO to submit grant applications and funding requests for low and zero emissions bus propulsion systems. It's not specific in that motion because we're looking at multiple grants. I may break the grant, I may break the thing into multiple grant submissions. I may send the same grant to 2 or 3 different programs. We're still working through some of that. So it's a little general. And I think, I know one question one of you had was about how many buses are we talking about here, and what's the implication to the capital reserve. So I wanted to spend a little bit of time making sure we were clear about that. With that, Madam Chair, I've talked enough. Happy to open it up for questions and discussion.
Thank you, Mr. Carpenter. I just have a quick question. You just alluded to verbiage about a motion. Can you please tell me what page that was on? Because I'm...
Page 62 at the top of the issue brief, recommended action.
Thank you so much.
And if Dina is on, we could promote her to panelist. That might be the good time.
So I just understand that Mr. Carpenter said that Dina Reed, our CFO, is online and available for questions. Hi, Dina. And so now it's open. Susan, I see your hand up, and then Mike will be second.
Thank you. I had a couple questions. Question number 1 is under scope. We talk about this as a learning opportunity, and that includes 12 months of operations in all seasons. I'm assuming, given what we had done previously with Title VI, that also means on all routes. If it's a learning, we're going to see whether or not these things are able to deal with the system. So it's not just all season, it's also going to be on a variety of routes. Yes?
Excellent memory. Yes, Title VI does require us to circulate new buses. Title VI doesn't have anything to say about propulsion systems, but new buses do need to not be concentrated in any one area. So thank you for that clarification. You are correct. As part of the operation, it would be methodically circulated through each of the routes in the system.
Thank you. Second question on fiscal responsibility. This is page 86. It speaks to capital costs. Are these net? If we are replacing existing diesel with the diesel hybrid, I can see that there's no additional operating costs, but is this an additional capital cost?
Thank you.
Is
Excellent
that
question.
a net or a gross?
So if I might, on page 66, the financial table, I believe a good example of this question is in the middle column, hybrid bus project. You'll see capital costs, 47.9 million. Below that is a big zero. Ms. Pauley is correct. This is marginal additional costs in both categories. So we're already running, these are replacement buses. So diesel is leaving, a hybrid is coming out. So our number one cost is labor. We already got a driver who's already driving bus. We're not paying for that again. So that cost nets out. Same thing, fuel. It's very hard for us to gauge the fuel savings between a diesel and a hybrid because the diesels we have are pretty efficient. There will be some savings there, but it's not worth trying to quantify there. The insurance is roughly the same. So no, we don't perceive any additional operating cost from these replacement buses. But yes, the marginal additional capital cost is on top of what we would have paid for conventional diesels.
Thank you. And my final question has to do with this as a learning deployment, even assuming it may be several years till we get them, which is to ask that as part of our learning that there be some kind of reporting. What are we experiencing? What was the savings? What were the issues? I think that if the ideas were setting the board up for a bigger decision down the road and the community, I think it would be helpful as a part of it now to be anticipating some kind of reporting during this learning period. What that looks like, I'll leave to staff, but I think it would be helpful for the board as policymakers to understand as we're getting into it, what we are learning.
If I might, that's an excellent suggestion. We do have in the timeline on page 68 a sort of after action report to come back, but I take this to be also about keep us up to date during the project. I think that's easy to commit to. I'll probably have to tie Troy to a chair to keep him from providing updates during the course of the project. So I don't think I have any trouble committing to that.
Very good. Mike?
Yep. First of all, I wanted to say that I am very much in favor of Matt's proposal. And I don't want to have it delayed. I know it's critical to move expeditiously. But I have to say, I'm really uncomfortable with what we really need to authorize today. I mean, the words here, motion to authorize the CEO to submit grant applications and funding requests for low and zero emission bus propulsion systems. Now that is really, there's lots of uncertainty here going forward. I understand that. And things are going to change. But I just feel uncomfortable with such a broad authorization. I mean, there's all kinds of numbers and assumptions in Matt's proposal that are behind here. In fact, he even said tonight, he's not asking for any authorization for dollars. I didn't read that into what I was reading because there's lots of dollars and estimates of dollars in there, and ranges of dollars and things like that. And so I want to go forward. I don't want to delay, but I feel uncomfortable that it's such a broad authorization. I'll just leave it at that.
Matt, you or Dina, do you have a response?
Sure. And I think, first of all, what Mike has articulated, I think is a very reasonable question. How much of an authorization do you want to give? What I have suggested in that recommended term is kind of the maximum flexibility to Dina and I in terms of the ability to pursue any funding opportunity, basically, because there are numerous grants or earmarks or things that we could pursue. We didn't want to limit it, for example, to low-no, because then that's the only option I got. And I want to have more latitude, frankly, than that to go hunt money anywhere I can find it. But it helps contribute to a somewhat general motion language. Whatever the board ultimately is comfortable with, we will work with that. The more restrictions you put on us does limit our flexibility to go after different sources, to recombinate these things, to get a better leverage off a different thing. But it is very much what the board is comfortable with. That is the defining factor here. Oh, there was another point. I've lost it. But Dina, do you have anything to add on that point?
Yeah, I would like to add some clarification. So Matt has discussed this a little bit earlier, and I just want to accentuate the point. The portion of the total project that we put in front of you today that requires, normally the construction policy requires the board approval. If it was just that one piece, it would be about $4.3 million of the $9.3 million of the hydrogen bus project. So every other bus, everything above that is really replacement buses for the buses that we already have. They are a little more expensive per bus for hydrogen or the hybrid. But the numbers that you're seeing in front of you, the reason there's such a range is because we're looking at estimates that can range over a 5-year period for our normal bus replacements of 8 a year, which is up to 40 buses. So it does go above the dollar amount that we would normally spend on a bus if we get the grant, but it's not money that we're not already spending on buses. It's just a different dollar amount for the different amount. So I think, Mike, to your point, a specific number will be decided as we understand and kind of package this grant proposal. And before we actually buy anything, we would be notifying the board of what the actual application is, and it wouldn't exceed what we put in front of you today, or because this is what it would cost to replace our current fleet in the current replacement cycle for this amount. So I guess the clarification is that while there are lots of numbers, to give you a broader context, which is the point of it, to give you the full context of all the things that we're considering, the hybrid bus project itself is 9.3 million, and of that, about half is for construction, and that's kind of the piece that we would normally ask only for, but for context, we want to provide all of the information that we have about the whole proposal together.
And if I might, while she was speaking, I remembered a couple of options I could give you for consideration. If you wanted to amend the motion to say more clarity about the scope I had kind of assumed it included the scope that's referenced here in this, the number of buses, the types of things. If you wanted to amend the motion to say, for low and zero emissions bus propulsion systems as outlined in the attachment, that would constrain us in terms of the scope, and we're not going off to buy, something you've never heard of before. So that's an option that exists for you. Another option, kind of, it's not a delay per se, but it is a deferral of this decision. Dina and I are pushing to nail down the number of buses and therefore the financials by next month. We do have a transition plan that we're starting to write that is a required approval from the federal government. The board has to approve it. So I have to bring that to you. Frankly, it's mostly that graph, the green and gray graph. You could defer this decision until a later date when we have more specificity about that. If you wanted, specific, like not to exceed kind of numbers, that wouldn't delay our ability to put in the grant, but it would delay your decision here today about, are we doing this or not? But I don't sense any real question about that from you as a body. So those are just some options, Mike.
Thanks, Matt. I would feel more comfortable with adding language like you had mentioned, referring to within the scope of what was presented to us today. That along with an update every month as we have a board meeting in terms of where we stand and particularly regarding what we approved in concept was outlined to us today and what's changed and give the board the opportunity to understand that and to see if they're still comfortable with the whatever we might approve today.
I think those are very reasonable expectations, and I had sort of assumed in my mind that, as we moved forward we would continue to come back to you every month and just sort of let you know how the numbers were penciling down, what the final decisions would be. And then, before the actual submission, last chance to hit the, bailout button would probably be there. So I don't think any of those are concerns, Mike. Your authorization today, however, would give me sort of this symbolic, yes, we're ready to do this. But I'm happy to come back. No concerns there.
I would also add, to support that, Mike, future budgets would certainly identify the types of buses that we'd be buying, in addition to the monthly updates that you suggested. This is what we're proposing, or what we've talked about here is a 5-year program. And so all of this would be incorporated into the cost estimates and the funding sources as we would update the capital budget in accordance with the plans and whatever funding that we get, if we get any. And I would also mention that all of this is contingent on grant funding. So everything in the proposal is contingent upon a grant funding. Other than we'll continue to replace our buses today with diesel buses until we get the grant funding or additional funding source to support a higher cost. But for now, everything in here is contingent upon a grant approval. And then one clarification I would like to make in the table, when there was a discussion about the table on page 66, the total amount of buses for the hybrid bus project, 47.9 million. That's the total price of all 40 buses, not the difference between the cost of 40 diesel buses and the hybrid buses. So the difference between replacing our current fleet with 40 diesel buses versus 40 hybrid is about $12 million incremental. So it would normally be around 35 million, not 40. Well, it's closer to, closer to 48 million. So it's about 13 million, 12 to $13 million incremental for the buses. The operating costs, however, are the incremental only and not the total operating costs. So I just wanted to be clear. And I think those numbers were presented that way because that's what we would ask for in the grant. When we put in for the grant, we have to put in the total cost of the project, either hydrogen or hybrid. So those numbers are a little bit different. I just want to clarify that.
Thank you, Dina. So I was wrong in my answer to Susan earlier, but thankfully corrected.
Mike, did you have anything else? No. Are there any other questions? Okay, so we've come to the decision part, and it's time for us to think thoughtfully about how we would like to prepare this motion. Yes, please, of course, Mike.
I would just,
Mike, your mic.
Yeah, I was just scribbling something down in the last 30 seconds, and here is a proposal, and it could certainly be wordsmith, but here's my idea, and that the board authorizes the grant submission as outlined in the information provided to the board today, and with monthly reports to follow to the board on the project status and any significant changes from what was given the board today.
Mike, or Matt?
I might suggest one minor change. Everything Mike said was great. Could I suggest authorize grant applications and funding requests, because I want to cast a wider net. Earmark is not a grant. I want to make sure I don't limit ourselves here.
Yes, I understand why that would be important.
Are there any other ideas outside of what Mike is proposing? Mike, would you like to frame that in the form of a motion?
Yes, I would like to move that the board authorize the grant submission and funding request as outlined in the board information provided to the board today, and with monthly reports to follow to the board on project status and significant changes from what was given to the board today.
Is there a second? Seconded by Chris. Is there any discussion on this motion? Seeing no discussion, we're going to take it for a vote. All those in favor of this motion, please raise your hands. And that motion went unanimously. Thank you, everyone, for your hard work. Thank you to all the staff, Matt, Dina, all the staff who worked very hard on this, Troy. Yeah, exactly. Now the hard work begins. Thank you very much. I feel like we should be yelling Yahoo and popping champagne. We're going to go on to our next operational update, and that is by Mr. Brooks. He's going to talk about the weather-related service disruptions that the ride experienced. Mr. Brooks?
Good evening, everybody.
Good
The
evening.
reason I wanted to come in and give you a little explanation of the recent service suspension is it's very rare that we cancel service due to weather-related issues. There was one other time since I've been here, coming up on my 1-year anniversary, that this happened, and it was last year during our storm where we had 10 inches of snow. I want to give you an overview of how we came to the decision-making process. On January 12th at approximately noon, we opened up our storm event managing system. Things escalated rather quickly, and just around 3 p.m. in the afternoon, we started facing challenges. We were getting buses stuck. We were able to respond pretty quickly. We authorized our towing service to go into effect. We started rescuing buses ourselves. But every hour we communicated to each other, all the department heads, our call takers, our dispatchers, and also our safety department, keeping a finger on the pulse as a liaison between the county and the city. But by 3 p.m., we had multiple routes that were affected, 20-minute delays, 35-mile-an-hour winds, 1 inch of snow accumulation, and multiple detours. However, we deemed it still to be safe for our operators and safe for our customers. I'm going to share with you a couple of pictures and a short video of what we faced out there. But rather quickly, by 4 p.m., it was starting to get dicey. Again, we were 20-minute delays. As quickly as we dug buses out, they were getting stuck again. And then the snow started accumulating rather quickly. And then the challenges became more and more dire between the hours of 4 and 9 p.m., especially between 8:15 and 9:15. That's when the freezing rain started, and we experienced multiple accidents. My biggest fear was the accidents that we experienced during our rescue operations. Specifically, we had a couple buses that slid into each other during the rescue, and I was really concerned about our personnel. So that was a part of the decision-making process. At 9 o'clock, I spoke with my department heads, Troy, Yvette, Gail, and the head of safety. We talked about what's the best course here. We want to be able to fight another day. We want to get our operators home safely. And just as important, I didn't want to see any of our staff get injured. So from talking to the department heads, the head of safety, at 9 o'clock, we said, let's cancel service, suspend service at 9:30, get our people back home, finish out the night rescuing buses, getting them back into the barn so that we can come back with full service in the morning. By this time, we had 31 buses stranded. We had multiple accidents, 4 accidents. We were getting lit up both positively and negatively on social media. I have a video I'm going to share with you in a minute. I did leave the audio out because it's rather colorful in nature, and I didn't want to share F-bombs with you. So, but we worked overnight. We got the buses back. The most important thing to me, nobody was injured. No operator was hurt. No reports of our customers being hurt. Out of the 4 accidents, 2 of our buses are still shopped. The other 2 have been released. And I just wanted to let you know how important that we take this. Canceling service is a big deal. And part of that is we hate to leave our customers out there stranded, but I had to weigh what was important. And keeping people safe and getting people home was the most important to me on that day. But this is a picture of Route 22, Bus 513. During the rescue, we came very close to a near miss. See how close the buses slid into each other? My concern was when I saw that, and I was being communicated to in real time, pictures coming to my phone. What happens if one of our rescue people had get crushed in between that? It was very concerning to me. And all of my team, we were all talking constantly. This was another accident where, talking to Jesse earlier, we talked about some of the buses that were fishtailing. This was another rescue where we were trying to pull it out. The bus fishtailed and backed into a parked vehicle. This is the video I wanted to share with you. And basically what you're going to see here is the amount of buses that just couldn't move anymore. And this was between the hour of 8:15 and 9:15 when we finally made the decision. And what you're going to see here is one of our customers that disembarked from one of our buses was rather close to home, but on his way home, he took video of all the buses that were stranded on routes 22 and 23. This would be in between, somewhere about the halfway point going towards Ypsilanti. Okay, I'm not sure. I think it was Packard. I think you're right. But as you can see, they're stuck. And they're not moving. And the gentleman that's walking along, he was actually one of our customers that's videoing it, and then ended up on social media and shared with everybody. Yeah. Here's a perfect example of it, the fishtailing. Even when you try to back out. And what had happened in that last hour, as quickly as we got them out, they were stuck again. And it just, we finally made the decision, let's just get everybody home and live to fight another day. And that's it. That's pretty much it. That's about a wrap. If there's any questions I can answer.
The floor is open to the board if anybody has a question for George. George, while I understand that it was a very difficult decision to make, we never want to leave our passengers stranded. I know that it was very hard. It was a very hard fought battle, and we really appreciate the fact how hard all the teams worked. The fact that there were only 4 buses injured, 2 are back out in the field, and that that there were no injuries or fatalities. Says volumes. So thank you so much for your presentation.
Thank you.
With that, we're going to move into the next, which is the audit update. Is Dina still with us, Deb? Very good.
Thank you. Hi.
Welcome
Well,
back.
I don't know how to follow that up with the audit report. That's a very emotional scene, and of course, we're so thankful for everyone being safe. But on audit, everyone's safe with the audit. It's moving along as expected. We are expecting our first draft of the financial reports next week. We are currently on track for a meeting with the audit task force. It looks like it's going to be around just February 12th. And then we plan to introduce the report to the Finance Committee on February 13th, and then to the full board for acceptance on February 22nd, well ahead of schedule from last year. We'll keep you informed if there are any changes, but at this time, that's our expectation. Just want to iterate how different it's been this year and what a great job staff is doing with getting up to speed. This is the first audit year for our finance manager, and she's doing a great job stepping in and keeping up, and things are definitely improving from that perspective. So we're really pleased about that. And I don't have any exciting videos to show you. I don't think that you'd find them interesting, but she's working very hard, and our whole team is working to support this project. So those are my updates, and I'm happy to answer any questions.
Is there anyone on the board who'd like to ask a question of the CFO? Seeing none, Dina, thank you so much for the update.
You're
I
welcome.
look forward to hearing from you in February. Very good. Next on our agenda is the CEO report, and we're back to Matt.
Thank you, Madam Chair. In the light of the time, I'll simply say that the report is in your packet. A lot of good progress going on in many areas. I'm happy to answer any questions if there are any.
Is there anyone on the board who wants to pull any information out of the CEO report? And I see Rich has his hand up.
Yeah, so I appreciate the report as always. My question is in regards to the staffing update. Whereas staff is working to hire additional employees for the fleets, for the LRP. I just was wondering, how is that looking overall? Like, are we fairly short? Are we 50% of where we want to be staffing wise to implement that here this year? I was just kind of curious.
Sure. I'm going to defer to Troy, who seems to have magically evaporated when the first maintenance question comes up. So I'm going to kick it over to George.
Hear me? Yes. Your concern is the hiring of the operators. Okay. I'm more confident right now that this is going to be handled in increments and that we will be able to meet the expectations of the service that we will provide from the new millage. We have a game plan in place that we will have the additional 6 operators hired to start rolling out the service in April. And that will require 6 additional operators. We anticipate that we will need to hire 20 additional operators after that, with the approach that we will be able to run the full service in August. We are making progress. We have a game plan in place, and I'm more optimistic than the last time I spoke to you. The last time I said I was cautiously optimistic. I am more optimistic that we're going to meet that expectation. And that's due to the good work that our HR department is doing right now.
And George, if I might, just to clarify, the April service is the express bus?
Correct.
And the August services are everything else?
Exactly.
Thank you.
Any other questions or comments? Mike?
Yes, I just wanted to add one thing to Matt's report on the MDOT Washington Avenue and US 23 study in the meeting that's going to be on February 1 that people can attend. For people who can't attend, or for people who might otherwise want to provide some input but can't be there, I just wanted to mention that I saw that there are provisions to provide comments. I believe it's directly to MDOT online on both of those 2 studies that are being done. One with the M23, the other with the Washington corridor. And I can't remember where I found that. I think it was on the announcement that talked about this meeting. But anyway, people can do that.
Oh. Forrest, did you want to speak to that? Hi, welcome.
Sure, thank you. Yeah, thanks, Mike, for bringing that up. Actually, I'm just drafting an email, make board members aware that public engagement opportunity. So you will see some links in my email on there. There's some details about their public meeting and their project website. So we've been working with MDOT project team on this. So we're excited to see they propose some alternatives. One of the alternatives has bus lane incorporated into it. Thank you, Mike.
Very good. Any other questions for the CEO or the CEO report? Seeing none, we're going to move on to a very special guest. I'd like to take this opportunity, first of all, to thank the Governance Procurement Task Force. They completed their work, and through their efforts, the contract was awarded to Ms. Susan Radwan. Susan is maybe not new to all of us. She was with us at the beginning when we first began policy governance and worked with us, I believe it was until 2016. And then she also runs the boot camp that some of us have had an opportunity to attend. Susan has a wealth of experience and knowledge working in policy governance. She trained under the Carvers, I believe, in 1997. And so we're very excited to have her with us. And take it away, Susan.
Great. Thank you so much, Kathleen. Good evening. I'm sure you are all really excited that I'm presenting right now after a very long meeting, but I will be brief. So I do want to just share with you a little bit about the policy governance framework. Policy governance is a systems approach to governing, whereas most governing is focused on, it's more personality driven. Where whoever's the chair, that determines what the agenda is, and that's not policy governance. What policy governance is about is seeing to it that the organization achieves what it should and avoids unacceptable situations. It's at a very high level, and it causes you as board to hold the whole of the organization in your hands when you are discussing anything. So if you're talking about low emissions or no emissions, how does that strategically position you as the AAA TA? As Rich said, we want to be ahead of the curve all the time, right? And so, you want to always keep in mind, how do those things strategically position this organization? In terms of and in that space, you want to optimize the parts in order to maximize the whole. So you were talking earlier tonight about, data collection. You want to optimize data collection and the cost of it, in that by optimizing rather than maximizing data collection, which would create then, an inefficient system because you're getting more than what you need. So you want to optimize the parts in order to maximize the whole. Governing itself is from a helicopter perspective, governing well. I bring my helicopter, I will have it always with me. That perspective, when you are in the helicopter helicopters go up about 6,000 feet. And when you're at 6,000 feet, not 30,000 above the clouds, but 6,000 feet, you can see the ground. You can see what's happening in the environment. You probably can see your destination, but you can also see how things are connected and the interrelationship from the helicopter perspective. And it's your insights about those things that becomes really important to understand and to share. What is the insight that you see as you're looking at some of the decisions and the policies that you are working with. That helicopter perspective also is, in the governing role, there are two things that you are accountable for. One of them is working on the organization. The second is checking on the organization. The working on the organization, you do that through your policy development. The checking on is what you do through your monitoring. And so policy governance builds into its framework the helicopter perspective. Now that's different though than, the managing. Governance is not management. And sometimes when people tend to, go into the weeds and ask a lot and get into, some of the decisions that are really operational in nature, that's management focus, a management lens. And governance is not that. Governance is from that higher perspective. If you think about, the governing so as many of you know, I co-wrote this book, Governing by Principles, with my colleague Eric Kramer, who is now retired. And I want to call your attention to the little circle there in blue. So policy governance started with John Carver exploring theory, creating theory, looking for theory in governing. From what he learned from that exploration, he created the principles, 10 principles. Actually, he started with 7 and now it's 10. John Carver has now retired, but he evolved the model over the years to recognize that they didn't say everything that needed to be pulled out in the 7 principles that were originally published. So it's 10 principles now. But the thing with the principles is that those principles should flow through the context of the organization, and then you create your policies. I will suggest to you that when this organization first adopted policy governance, you started with a template of policies that were created by the Carvers. They were typical policies that did not consider the context of this organization. And perhaps in your future policy work, you might want to just consider that all of the policies that you have right now may not be relevant, and maybe there is an opportunity to right size your policy manual or contextualize your policy manual appropriately. Once you have that flow of the context into your policies, then that's where you develop practices. So this flow is, it is really core to understand. You have to understand the principles, or it's helpful to understand the principles of the model so that those principles can flow through your work. Now, as I teach policy governance, I like to think about these 10 principles, which are all on the screen right now. I put them in 3 buckets. The 3 buckets are, the first bucket is board culture, and the whole concept of ownership and how you as the board represent and speak
You are the voice of the ownership. You are not only the voice, but you are the informed voice and agent of that ownership. And that influences then your context of how you are together. The ownership is a collective. And as you work as a board, you operate as a collective. Board is a singular collective noun. The board is. So you have to work as one body. So that board culture is incorporated into your governance process policies. And you may want to, again, contextualize how you are together. The second bucket is the structure of policies themselves. You have basically four types of policies. And there are two kinds of board meetings, which are basically your instruction manual, and then the executive limitations, and then the policy size, which is about the formatting and the breadth of policy. The last bucket is the board CEO relationship. And so the idea of the clear and coherent delegation, the clear role delineation is a core principle, a core concept in good governance. And so you delegate clearly and coherently to the operations of the organization, and you hold for yourselves the governing part. Also, that reasonable interpretation. After tonight's conversation, I think there are a few things that we might want to talk about in terms of what is a reasonable interpretation, or to think about what does it mean to be any reasonable interpretation, which is the threshold for considering interpretations. And then the monitoring. So the monitoring piece is all about the accountability, creating the culture of accountability for this organization in terms of all the operations and your governing. So when you are participating in that, in doing self-evaluation, that's an important part to assure performance. It's not just assuring performance of Matt, it is assuring performance of all the pieces. We want to optimize the parts in order to maximize the whole. So we have to optimize your governing role as well in that, not just the operations. So when you think about these three buckets, the three board job products are specifically ownership linkage, which I know Rich is working on, and we're going to have a conversation about that. The policy development is the second deliverable, and I know you've done a ton of work around that. And then the third one is assurance of performance, which you did on the ends tonight. One thing that I would just like to mention about your conversation tonight, when you're talking about ends monitoring, it is about achievement. It's not compliance. The compliance belongs with the executive limitations, but the ends focus is about achievement. Have we achieved the metrics that are part of the interpretation? So we have a little bit of work to do there so that we get clarity around what is achievement in that process. So with that, I'm going to stop because of the hour, but I do want to offer you an opportunity for questions.
Thank you so much, Susan, and welcome again. Are there any questions from the board, comments? I'm not seeing any. Thank you so much for your time, and welcome again.
Thank you. I look forward to working with you all.
Next on our agenda is, we don't have any emergent items at all that I know of. All right, then we're going to go ahead and move on to our closing items. First one up is the action item recap. Mr. Carpenter and Ms. Holt.
Thank you. So not a whole lot. I think the action items that I've captured as part of your authorization of the zero emissions grant and funding request applications, more regular updates will be forthcoming. I also think Dina said there's more to come on the audit. Those are the only two really sort of next step action items that I caught. Deb, did you notice anything else?
Thank you. Next is just the topics for our next meeting, audit update, financial conditions 2.5, and we'll get our fiscal year 24 quarter one financial report. It bears to mention to the public and to remind us that in February, we are going to be meeting in Ypsilanti at the Riverside Arts Center on the 4th floor. That is Thursday, February 22nd, 2024. So put that little nugget in your calendars. Deb, we're going to open up public comment now. Is there anyone online?
social media about the location change. We're going to make sure that the public is aware on our events calendar and put it on Instagram, Facebook, that type of stuff. So we're getting it out there.
Very good to hear that. And then lastly is our adjournment. Do I have a motion to adjourn? Susan, seconded by Simi. All those in favor, raise your hand. That passed unanimously. Everyone have a wonderful night and be safe out there in that fog we're having.